On a crisp autumn morning, in the village of St. Mildred's on the hill, where rose-trimmed hedges lined the lanes, and each household could be counted on to know the state of everyone else's garden, a strange sound interrupted the usual peace. The church bell rang. Once. It was an old bell, with a slow, solemn tone that most villagers associated with funerals. But no burial was scheduled that morning, nor had any death recently been announced. The bell rope hung inside the small stone church, and only the vicar, or whomever the vicar appointed, ever came near it. St. Mildred's was not the sort of place where bells rang without reason, yet the bell had tolled just once, and then silence. Those who heard it paused in their daily business. Mrs. Penberry stopped clipping chrysanthemums and stared out across her garden. Young Tommy Hargreaves halted his bicycle mid-pedal, and at the edge of the green, Miss Jane Marple, leaning on her walking stick as she took her morning turn, lifted her head with mild surprise. She did not look alarmed, merely thoughtful. "It is early," she murmured to herself as though commenting on the weather, and so terribly final a bell tone. Within the hour, speculation had already reached boiling point at the high street shops. By the bakery, Mrs. Carter insisted it must have been a mistake. At the post office, Mr. Finch said it was undoubtedly a sign, though of what he could not say. At the tea rooms, it had become, in the span of 20 minutes, a premonition, but it was Mrs. Whitcomb who brought the most disturbing news. "I saw someone entering the church," she announced breathlessly over her scones. "Just before the bell sounded, someone I didn't recognize." That, of course, was more than enough to set St. Mildred's ablaze. By mid-afternoon, the vicar, Reverend Albert Linton, found himself surrounded by curious inquiries and concerned looks. He was a soft-spoken man, with gentle spectacles and a patient manner, but even he looked unsettled as he repeated the same answer again and again. "No, I did not ring the bell, and I assure you, nobody should have been inside the church at that hour." The vicar, being a sensible man, went to look. The church door had been unlocked, which was not unusual in such a trusting village, but the interior was still and neat, the pews empty, the pulpit undisturbed, and the bell rope perfectly in place. No footprints, no signs of intrusion, no explanation. The incident might have settled into rumor and gradually diluted into legend, as oddities sometimes do in peaceful places, if it weren't for the discovery the following morning. At first, it was only the milkman who noticed it, a shape lying behind the stone wall near the lich gate. He thought it was a bundle of cloth someone had dropped, but as he drew closer, the stillness of the human form became unmistakable. A body, face up, pale, frozen in surprise, almost as if he had been startled at the last moment of his life. The man was not known to the village. No one recognized him. No one could say where he had come from. But Miss Marple, who had also come to see, looked very carefully at the man's hands, his shoes, the faint impression of mud splashed on his coat, the small tear in his cuff. She said nothing. She did not gasp, nor wring her hands as others did. She simply looked, and then quietly, she asked the vicar one single question. "Reverend Linton, the bell rope. You said it was perfectly in place." "Yes, Miss Marple, quite undisturbed." She gave the faintest nod. "Then I wonder," she said softly, "if the bell was not rung by hand at all." The villagers couldn't make sense of that, but Miss Marple did not explain herself, not yet. She simply continued to observe. Within the hour, the constable from the neighboring town arrived, followed later by Detective Inspector Graves from the county seat. They treated the scene with professional efficiency, though some of the locals whispered that Graves had far too stern a face for such a lovely place as St. Mildred's. The official statement was straightforward enough. A man had died, cause unknown, identity unknown, circumstances highly suspicious. But it was the timing that clung to every whispered conversation across the village square. The bell had rung before the body had been found, before anyone even knew a death had occurred. As the evening shadows lengthened and lanterns glowed softly in the windows of cottages along the lane, Miss Marple prepared herself a small supper and sat in her parlor, knitting quietly. Her expression was mild, her manner calm. Only her eyes revealed her thoughts. "In all my years," she said softly to herself, "it is never the bell that matters. It is who needed it to be heard, and who believed it would not be questioned outside." The village settled uneasily into night. The mystery had only just begun. The villagers of St. Mildred's rose the next morning with a sense of muted urgency, as though a chill had crept beneath every doorway overnight. Curtains twitched more frequently than usual, and conversations that might have ordinarily been about weather or jam, preserves instead hushed into fragmented whispers of speculation. The unknown man's body had been taken to the small mortuary room behind the surgery, but his presence lingered in the village more palpably than if he were still lying beside the church wall. The Bell and Lantern, the local inn where travelers occasionally passed through on summer walking tours, Mrs. Sprott insisted she had seen a stranger in the village not 2 days earlier, tall, tired-looking, carrying a satchel, but she could not say whether he was the man found near the church, and her recollection shifted with each retelling, which made the villagers both more suspicious and less certain all at once. Miss Marple, who had taken her usual place at the edge of the village green with her knitting, watched quietly as the theories spun themselves out untidily. She did not contribute to them. Instead, she watched how people reacted, the ones who spoke too hastily and those who were altogether too silent. Detective Inspector Graves, meanwhile, stationed himself in the vicar's study. He was a man who valued efficiency and direct answers, and St. Mildred's, with its soft-spoken pauses and politely veiled implications, did not make things easy. The Reverend Linton sat opposite him, still unsettled. So the church door was unlocked? Graves asked. "It often is," the vicar replied. "We like to believe this is a place where one may seek quiet at any hour." "And the bell," Graves continued. "You're certain no one rang it?" The vicar hesitated. "I did not, and I know of no one who would. That bell is not rung except for service or for the departed, and we had neither occasion." Miss Marple, who had called in to bring the vicar a plate of scones, her presence quite natural under the circumstances, spoke gently, as though offering only a passing reflection. "Fear can make one believe in accidents," she said, "but I very much doubt we are dealing with one." Graves looked up at her. The lines of skepticism in his expression softened just slightly. He had heard of Miss Jane Marple, of course. Stories travel in curious ways, especially stories of elderly spinsters who solve murders with nothing more than good sense and observation. He was not so quick as to dismiss her presence. "May I ask," he said carefully, "what makes you say so?" Miss Marple's eyes remained on her knitting. Her tone was mild. "When people act in haste, Inspector, they forget that others may notice the little things they overlook." She paused, counting stitches. The splashes on the poor man's coat. Those were not from the churchyard. The mud there has dried, you see, after those 2 days of clear weather. but someone unfamiliar with the village would not think to check his path. Someone guided him from elsewhere. The vicar blinked. The inspector straightened. "You mean he was brought here?" Graves asked. "Possibly," Miss Marple replied. "Or he came from somewhere he thought was safe, only to find it was quite the opposite." There was a soft knock at the door then, and Mrs. Linton entered with a strained expression that suggested she was trying to remain composed for her husband's sake. "There is someone who wishes to speak to you, Albert," she said. She seems quite distraught." The inspector looked toward the doorway with keen interest. The vicar nodded, and in stepped a young woman, small, breathless, her gloved hands trembling where she clasped them tightly before her. Her fair hair was pinned neatly, though one stray curl clung anxiously to her cheek. She looked as though she had not slept. "I believe," she faltered, her eyes shifting between the three of them, "I believe I know who the man is." The room fell still. "His name is Stephen Harbury," she said, "and he was engaged to my sister." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-loop. "And where?" the inspector asked, his voice level though his attention sharpened. "Is your sister now?" The young woman swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "She vanished 3 days ago." The young woman's name was Clara Harbury, and she sat now in the vicar's study with her hands folded tightly in her lap, as though she feared they might shake if she released them. The inspector offered her a glass of water, which she accepted but barely touched. Miss Marple, observing from her usual quiet angle, saw the slight tremor in Clara's mouth each time she inhaled. Grief, yes, but something else as well. Anticipation, perhaps, or fear of what her own words might confirm. "My sister," Clara began, her voice steadier now that she'd committed herself to speaking, "is named Alice. She works as a school teacher in Market Harrow. She became engaged to Stephen Harbury not 2 months ago. It was all very sudden, too sudden, our aunt said." Clara's eyes flickered downward, but they seemed happy, or at least very determined to appear so. The inspector leaned forward. "When did you last see either of them?" 3 days ago, Clara replied. "Alice came to stay with me in Lower Barcombe for a brief visit. Stephen arrived the next morning to collect her. They said they were going to take a walk through the countryside before returning home, but they never came back." Miss Marple's needles chimed quietly as she knit. "And you began to worry, naturally." Clara nodded. "Yes. I wrote to the inn in Market Harrow to ask if they had returned. They had not. Then I went to the police, but they said it had been only a short while. They suggested they might have simply extended their trip." Inspector Graves exhaled through his nose. He knew the sort of young officer who gave such assurances. "And when you heard of a man found here?" Clara's voice broke. "I feared the worst." The room sat in the weight of that admission. Outside the study window, the churchyard yew branches stirred in a faint breeze, quiet, indifferent, eternal. Reverend Linton spoke gently. "Miss Harbury, are you aware of any reason your sister and Mr. Harbury might have come to St. Mildred's?" Clara hesitated, and hesitations, Miss Marple knew, were never empty. "There was someone they meant to meet," Clara said slowly. "A man Stephen had been corresponding with. I do not know his name. He was someone from Stephen's past. Alice mentioned it only once, and very reluctantly. I thought nothing of it at the time. But now," Inspector Graves pursed his lips. "So they came here to meet someone, and Mr. Harbury ends up dead, and your sister is missing." Clara nodded. The vicar murmured, "Oh, dear Lord," under his breath. Miss Marple's eyes, meanwhile, had shifted to the small tear near the cuff of Clara's left glove. A fresh tear, fraying slightly at the edge. Not from the journey, likely from clutching something tightly. A suitcase handle, perhaps, or something, or someone. she feared losing. "Clara," Miss Marple said in her soft grandmotherly manner, "forgive the question, but did your sister ever express worry? Anything at all?" Clara swallowed. She said that Stephen had secrets, that he feared someone had discovered them. She laughed after, said she was being dramatic, but she broke off, pressing her fingertips to her eyelids as if to hold her composure in place. I should have insisted she stayed. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, hands folded neatly. "Guilt is a clever tormentor, my dear. It visits the kind-hearted first, and lingers where it is least deserved." Clara lowered her hands, a tear sliding but no sob following it. She looked at Miss Marple with something like gratitude. Inspector Graves rose. "I will need to send for a larger team from the county. This has moved beyond a simple unidentified death." But Miss Marple shook her head, not sharply, but with quiet purpose. "That may be wise in time, Inspector," she said, "but for now, too many uniforms may drive the truth back into the shadows. People speak less freely when they feel they are being watched. And here," she looked again at Clara, "we are dealing with hearts already frightened." Graves considered her. After a moment he nodded once. Before anything further could be said, a knock sounded, firm, hurried, almost breathless. Mrs. Linton opened the door to find Mr. Finch, the postmaster, red-faced from haste. "Reverend, Inspector, they've just found something down by the river path. A handbag, a lady's handbag." Clara froze. "It's hers," she whispered before anyone even asked. Her voice cracked into certainty. "It's Alice's. I know it is." Miss Marple did not gasp or stiffen, but her eyes, clear and bright, sharpened. A handbag by the river path was not simply lost. It was placed. The river path lay just beyond the churchyard, a short walk down a narrow track, where the grass had been pressed by centuries of parishioners seeking quiet. The afternoon light filtered through late autumn branches as the small group made their way, with Miss Marple walking slightly behind Clara, who moved quickly despite the inspector's attempts to caution her pace. The handbag had been placed, or rather left, on a flat stone not far from the water's edge. It was a simple brown leather satchel, the sort a schoolteacher might carry, practical, not fashionable. Clara recognized it instantly and sank to her knees beside it, though she did not touch it. Her breath trembled in her throat. Inspector Graves held out a hand. No one should disturb it just yet. "Let me look first." He crouched and examined the ground. The grass bore the traces of recent disturbance, though in what pattern he could not yet say. No clear footprints, only scrapes and flattenings, as though someone had moved about quickly, perhaps anxiously. Miss Marple looked not at the handbag, but at the river. The water ran low this time of year, its surface dark and still in some places, briskly rippling in others. She had seen rivers before, many of them near villages like this. They were too often convenient places for secrets to be hidden. Clara's voice came in a strained whisper. "Open it, please. I need to know." Graves hesitated only a moment before lifting the clasp. Inside were everyday items: a small notebook, a fold of handkerchiefs, a simple silver pen, a small purse containing £2 and several shillings. These things seemed precisely as they should have been. But a letter, folded once, tucked just under the notebook, caught Miss Marple's attention. It was sealed, though poorly, as though done in haste. "Inspector," she murmured. He withdrew it carefully and broke the weakened seal. The writing inside was small, neat, but written in some distress. The lines slightly uneven. "I am frightened. I cannot say why. If anything happens to me, please ask for the truth. Stephen knows who he is meeting. He says we must trust him. I am trying, but someone has been watching us. I do not know who to trust. The signature was simply Alice. Clara turned her face away, shoulders bowing as though against a cold wind. The inspector folded the letter again, his jaw tightening. This is no longer a matter of uncertainty. Someone wanted to frighten her or silence her. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the words, "Someone has been watching us." There were many kinds of watchers, lovers, enemies, the merely curious. But fear that leads one to leave written traces comes only when the watcher is close enough to feel. "Inspector," she said gently, "I believe it would be wise to ask who in the village might have known Stephen beforehand. People do not wander to St. Mildred's without cause, and even meetings arranged elsewhere have a way of tying themselves to old acquaintances." Graves looked over at her, respectful now. "You believe the person they sought was local?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "that secrets rarely travel far from where they began." Before the inspector could speak again, Clara lifted her head. Her face was pale, but there was a clarity there that had not been present earlier. "There was someone," she said. "It only came back to me now. Stephen once visited this village years ago. Before he met Alice, he said he stayed at the inn. He said it was peaceful, but he never spoke of anyone he saw here." The inspector nodded slowly, already forming the next step. "We speak to Mrs. Sprott," he said. "If he stayed at the Bell and Lantern, she will remember him. She remembers everyone and everything." Miss Marple gave a faint, thoughtful smile. "Yes, Mrs. Sprott's memory is quite remarkable, though what she chooses to share is often the more interesting half of the matter." The river water murmured quietly nearby, as though it too was holding its secrets, and as the group turned back toward the village, Miss Marple glanced once more at the handbag on the stone. The placement was delicate, intentional, like a marker, not to hide a disappearance, but to promise a return. Mrs. Sprott was polishing the brass rail at the counter when they entered the Bell and Lantern, though she stopped the moment she saw the inspector, Clara, and Miss Marple. Her eyes, always alert for the smallest change in the village's atmosphere, flicked over their faces one by one. She set the cloth aside with a slow, deliberate movement. "You've found something," she said, though no one had yet spoken. "I can tell by the way the girl is standing, like she's bracing herself." Clara lowered her gaze, too weary to protest. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "We need to ask you about a man who may have stayed here some years ago," he said. "His name is Stephen Harbury." Mrs. Sprott did not look surprised. She looked instead as though she had always expected this name to resurface eventually. Just not today. "Yes," she said quietly. "I remember him." Her hands came together in front of her, folding but not trembling. "He stayed here 3 summers back. Spent about a week. Quiet fellow, pleasant enough, though I would not say cheerful. He seemed weighed down, thoughtful maybe, the kind who sits alone by the fire and doesn't say why." Clara breathed out, something between grief and recognition. "Did he meet anyone here?" Graves asked. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Sprott replied, and her expression pinched ever so slightly. "He spent time with Mr. Halcombe. You'll remember him." She said this last part to Miss Marple, who nodded once, her expression remaining mild, though her eyes sharpened. Mr. Halcombe was one of those village presences who appeared often and said little. A widower, tended his late wife's roses, attended church irregularly, gave the impression of a man who kept his conversations short, not out of rudeness but caution. "He is still in the village," Miss Marple said softly. "Lives in the cottage with the ivy that climbs a bit too aggressively up the window frames." "Yes," Mrs. Sprott confirmed, "though he's not been in for his usual supper this week. Odd that." Inspector Graves nodded once, decisively. "We'll speak with him." But Mrs. Sprott lifted a hand, not to stop them, but to guide the urgency. "You may want to take care in how you do that. Inspector, Mr. Halcombe is a gentleman until he isn't, and grief makes some people strange. He lost a great deal before most here even knew him." This, Miss Marple noted silently, was the sort of comment that carried more weight than words alone. As they left the inn, Clara moved close to Miss Marple. "Do you think this Halcombe man had something to do with Stephen's death?" she asked quietly. Miss Marple did not answer at once. She took in the cottage-lined street ahead of them, the yellowing hedges, the stillness in the air as the day leaned toward evening. "People rarely commit dreadful acts for reasons that seem dramatic at first glance," she said at length. "Most often they act out of very small things: hurt pride, wounded affection, fear of being exposed. If Mr. Halcombe and Stephen knew one another, whatever lay between them may not have been resolved." Clara absorbed this, lips pressed tight. Inspector Graves walked a few paces ahead, and the closer they drew to Halcombe's cottage, the heavier the silence became. The ivy curled thickly around the windows, exactly as Miss Marple had recalled, though now, in the fading light, it looked almost like something holding the house in place. The inspector knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Then, when still no reply came, he tried the door. It opened easily. The inside of the house was very still, not abandoned, but paused, as though someone had left in haste. A teacup sat half-finished beside a chair. A pair of gardening boots stood near the door. The hearth held embers from a fire that must have burned earlier that morning. But the house was empty. Miss Marple stepped forward slowly, her gaze sweeping the small sitting room. There, on the mantel, was a single-framed photograph. A young woman, smiling, alive, with dark hair styled in soft curls. Clara let out a small breath of recognition. "That's her," she whispered. "That's Alice." The photograph trembled where Clara's voice seemed to reach it, and Miss Marple, standing just behind her, saw something else. Next to the frame, on the mantel, lay a church program, St. Mildred's Service of Remembrance, dated only 4 days ago, and beneath it, tucked carefully, as though kept close, a train ticket, one way, unused, to Market Harrow, Alice's home. Miss Marple did not speak, but her eyes grew very still. The handbag had not been left near the river out of guilt, nor out of grief. It had been left as a message. Someone had not taken Alice away. Alice had left. Clara stared at the photograph far longer than the others, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning comprehension. The image of Alice, smiling, relaxed, alive, felt unbearably close and impossibly distant all at once. The room itself held the echo of someone recently present, the faint warmth of the hearth, the lingering scent of dried lavender near the window, the impression of footsteps that had not yet had time to fade. Inspector Graves moved through the small sitting room with measured care, his eyes passing over each object without touching anything. "She was here," he said quietly, "not long ago." Clara pressed a hand to her chest, steadying herself. But why leave her handbag behind? Why not come home? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the window where the ivy clung too tightly. She raised her fingers just slightly, not touching the glass, but observing the faint smudge of a handprint there, unclear whether it had been left in haste or in thought. When she turned back, her expression was gentle, but her eyes had sharpened to clarity. "People leave symbols when they cannot leave explanations," she said softly. "The handbag by the river was meant to be found. It tells us that Alice was alive when she left it. and that she wanted someone to understand she had gone of her own will, or at least not by force. Clara looked as though the floor beneath her had shifted, but she wouldn't leave Stephen. They were engaged. And yet, Miss Marple replied, the letter tells us she was afraid of something Stephen was involved in. Fear changes decisions. It does not always give us the luxury of noble consistency. Before Clara could respond, Inspector Graves motioned them toward a narrow door at the end of the hallway. It opened into a small workroom, simple, neat, and almost painfully personal. A writing desk, a few ledgers, small jars of dried flowers, and a drawer left slightly ajar. Inside that drawer lay a stack of letters, tied with string. Clara inhaled sharply. Alice's handwriting. Graves did not touch them yet. No signs of struggle, he murmured. No overturned chair, no broken glass, no violence. Miss Marple finished the thought in a quiet tone. Because Alice did not leave in a panic, she left with intent. But if she had intended to leave willingly, why was Stephen dead? It was Clara who broke the silence this time, her voice trembling only slightly. Mrs. Sprott said Mr. Halcombe had lost someone. Who was she? The inspector nodded to Miss Marple, who answered with a softness that suggested she had known the memory a long while. His wife, Lydia Halcombe, a kind young woman. She died under circumstances the village never fully understood. A tragic fall near the quarry, or so the official account went. But grief never truly leaves a person, and Mr. Halcombe became quiet, withdrawn, the kind of silence that holds words unspoken. Clara's gaze returned to the photograph of Alice on the mantel. The resemblance, soft dark curls, gentle eyes, was there. Subtle, but real, do you think? Clara whispered. That he believed Alice was like her. Miss Marple set her hand lightly on Clara's arm, not to comfort, but to steady the next thought. I think, she said, that Mr. Halcombe may have convinced himself of something the heart wished to believe. And Stephen Harbury may have threatened that belief. The inspector straightened abruptly, which means Halcombe is not running. He has gone to her, or she has gone to him. A stillness settled in the room, not fearful, but focused. Miss Marple lifted her eyes once more to the ivy at the window, curling, clinging, holding tight even where it was not welcome. Inspector, she said softly, we must find Alice. Not to accuse her, nor to condemn Mr. Halcombe, but because someone has already died for whatever truth lies between them. And you believe she is still in the area? Graves asked. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Very much so, because leaving is final, and the handbag told us she has not yet chosen finality. Outside, dusk began to settle, the shadows lengthening across the cottages and hedge-lined lanes. Somewhere, very near, a truth waited, and someone was praying, hoping that the bell at St. Mildred's would never ring again. Inspector Graves wasted no time. Once outside Halcombe's cottage, he sent a constable to discreetly inquire around the village, who had seen Mr. Halcombe last, and with whom. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, Clara, and the inspector walked along the lane as twilight deepened, the day thinning into a quiet, watchful dusk. Lamps flickered to life, one window at a time, as though the village were drawing its curtains against something it sensed, but could not yet name. Clara's steps grew slower. If Alice is truly nearby, why hasn't she come to me, or written more than that one letter? She did write more, Miss Marple replied gently. Those letters in the desk were hers. We have yet to see what they say. The answers are already waiting. We simply have not looked. Inspector Graves gave a short nod. We'll review them at the station. If Halcombe has her, we need to act quickly." Miss Marple walked just slightly behind them, her gaze moving not ahead but around, at windows, at hedges, at doors left open for evening air. She knew villages. Fear did not hide in shadows. It disguised itself in ordinary tidiness. And then she stopped. It was subtle. No sound, no cry, just a stillness in her posture. "Inspector?" she said softly. "Do you remember the bell?" Graves blinked. "The bell? Yes. It rang just before Harbury was found." "Exactly." Miss Marple's voice remained mild, but the clarity beneath it sharpened the air around them. The bell did not ring by hand. It rang because the rope was pulled indirectly, likely by weight. Stephen Harbury was already dead when the bell rang. Someone placed his body where it would pull the rope, just enough to sound once before falling free. Clara's breath caught. Then, the bell was not a signal of death. It was a signal to someone else. Miss Marple nodded. A message, one known to only two people, Stephen and the one he came to meet. "Mr. Halcombe." The inspector exhaled slowly. He knew Stephen was dead before anyone else. "Which means he wants time," Miss Marple finished. "Time with Alice before the truth comes crashing down." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "We have to find her. Now." They continued down the lane, this time with purpose, though Miss Marple's steps remained measured. She was thinking of the ivy, of the train ticket, of the photograph placed carefully, not treasured but displayed. "A claim? Mr. Halcombe does not think he has kidnapped Alice," she said quietly. "He believes he has saved her, rescued her from Stephen. To him this is not crime, but devotion. And devotion, when twisted by grief, becomes terribly certain of itself." Clara shuddered. But where would he take her? To some place where he felt safe with his memories. Miss Marple said, "Some place he once shared with his wife. The quarry would be too exposed, the inn too public, the cottage already abandoned. No," she paused, as though seeing something others could not. "He would choose somewhere gentle, somewhere quiet, somewhere she once admired." Clara looked at her blankly, until the memory surfaced. The meadow behind the old orchard. She whispered. "Alice mentioned it once. She said the air there smelled like mint and rain. She said it felt like stepping outside the world." Inspector Graves didn't wait for further confirmation. "We go, now." The path to the orchard lay beyond the village, where the lanes narrowed and the hedges grew wild. The sky had deepened to blue-gray, and the first star had appeared. Their footsteps were the only sound, until faintly they heard voices, not raised, not frantic, soft, speaking quietly. When they reached the meadow they saw them, Alice, seated on a fallen tree, her hands folded in her lap, pale, thin, not from injury but from sleepless fear, and beside her, Mr. Halcombe, speaking to her with the tenderness of someone who believed he was right. Alice looked up first. Her eyes widened with relief and apology all at once. "Clara, oh, Clara." Halcombe turned, and in his eyes there was no rage, only sorrow that had lost direction. "I did not harm him," Halcombe said simply. "He fell. It was an accident. But I could not let her go back to him. Not after I saw it in her face. The same fear Lydia had, the same sadness." Alice's voice came out broken, pleading, not for rescue, but for understanding. "He didn't kill Stephen," they argued. "Stephen slipped. It was raining. He tried to catch him." Inspector Graves stepped forward, slowly. "Mr. Halcombe, I need you to come with me." Halcombe looked not at the inspector, but at Miss Marple. She met his gaze without judgment, only truth. "Some kinds of love," she said gently. want to protect. But love cannot protect by claiming. It must release, otherwise it becomes the very danger it fears. Halcombe closed his eyes as though something long clenched inside him had finally loosened. "I only wanted to keep her safe," he whispered. Alice began to cry softly, not out of terror, but exhaustion. Clara rushed to her, and the two sisters held one another tightly. The inspector placed a hand on Halcombe's shoulder. He did not resist. As they walked back toward the village, the night settling fully around them, Miss Marple remained a few steps behind. She knew already that the truth was only mostly unearthed, because one question, quiet but insistent, remained. If Stephen Harbury slipped, who placed his body beneath the bell? The question hung in the back of Miss Marple's mind as the small procession made its way to the village. Alice with Clara's arm around her, Mr. Halcombe walking quietly between two constables, Inspector Graves close behind, satisfied that the immediate danger had passed. Yet Miss Marple's steps remained unhurried, thoughtful. She had not looked away from grief or remorse in Halcombe's eyes. Those emotions had been genuine. Halcombe believed himself responsible only for loving too strongly. He had no idea the body had been moved. Alice, exhausted and leaning into her sister, did not speak until they reached the vicarage gate. Her voice was barely more than a thread. "Stephen," he was frightened of someone. "He wouldn't tell me who. I thought it was something from his past. A debt, or maybe something foolish from his youth." Inspector Graves turned to her. "Did he speak of anyone by name? Anyone at all?" Alice shook her head. "He only said that if the meeting went well, everything would be finished. If it didn't," she swallowed. "He said we would leave the country, start somewhere new." Clara made a wounded sound. "He should have come to us. He thought he could handle it," Alice whispered. "He didn't want to involve me." Miss Marple listened, her face composed but attentive. Fear hidden by determination, a promise to someone, and a meeting that ended in an argument. But the bell was not an act of fear or panic. It had been deliberate, thought out, measured. Someone had wanted the village to find the body. Someone who knew exactly what a single toll of that particular bell meant. Inside the vicarage, Mrs. Linton fetched warm tea, though neither Alice nor Clara could manage more than sips. Mr. Halcombe sat quietly in the next room under watch, neither pleading nor protesting. Inspector Graves began sorting through the letters Clara had identified, spreading them across the vicar's writing table in careful rows. Miss Marple did not sort the letters. She read the envelopes first, dates, destinations, postmarks, patterns. Alice's letters to Halcombe had stopped 2 weeks before the engagement announcement. Yet Halcombe had continued to write. Of memories, of understanding, of what was shared despite time. But it was not obsession in the frantic sense. It was yearning, lonely yearning, the kind that echoes. Stephen's name appeared only once. In a curt, strained line in Halcombe's handwriting, "I cannot see him. Not again. Do not bring him here." Miss Marple tapped the letter lightly with one finger. "Inspector," she said quietly, "this is not the correspondence of men who merely argued. This is the tone of someone who knows something about the other and fears it." Graves frowned. "Stephen had secrets. We knew that." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but not the sort that begin in Market Harrow. The sort that linger in villages. The sort everyone knows and no one mentions." From the sitting room, Mrs. Sprott's voice carried faintly through an open window. She was speaking to someone outside. Miss Marple straightened very slightly. "Inspector," she said, "may I ask who first found the body behind the church wall?" "The milkman," Graves replied. "He reported it immediately." "And who," Miss Marple continued, "was the first to arrive after him?" Graves paused, thinking. Mrs. Penbury, I believe. She lives nearest the church. She saw him and fainted outright. The vicar came next, then Mr. Finch. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, quite in that order. And who keeps the church keys every night? The vicar, Graves answered. Though he said it cautiously now, Miss Marple's expression was very gentle, almost sorrowful. No, the vicar keeps the keys, but he does not close the church each evening. He is often late returning from rounds. It is Mrs. Penbury who visits before dark to place flowers and tidy hymn books. She has done so for years, very quietly, very faithfully. Graves stared at her. Are you suggesting Mrs. Penbury moved the body? I am suggesting, Miss Marple said softly, that Mrs. Penbury knew Stephen Harbury, and that she recognized him immediately. Clara looked up sharply. But Mrs. Penbury she's harmless. Everyone likes her. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Everyone likes her, because she has made certain to be liked. A woman who has lived alone 30 years, whose fiancé was lost under uncertain circumstances, a fall, they said, much like Lydia Halcombe, much like Stephen. Alice's breath caught. No, she whispered. Miss Marple continued, her voice no louder than a reading of evening prayer. She heard the argument, perhaps saw the fall, or arrived moments after. She believed Mr. Halcombe had suffered enough grief, and she believed Stephen was to blame for her own past loss as well. So she made the death into something else entirely, something solemn, something the village would not question. Inspector Graves spoke quietly now. She tolled the bell. To announce an ending, Miss Marple said, and to conceal the truth within ritual. The room held stillness like the hush before a storm. Clara whispered. She thought she was being kind. No, Miss Marple replied gently. She thought she was being right. And outside, faintly, the sound of Mrs. Penbury's warm voice drifted through the window, welcoming, familiar, steady. The kind of voice no one ever suspects until the moment arrives when they must. Inspector Graves didn't rush outside. He stood very still for a moment, absorbing what Miss Marple had said. The air in the vicarage seemed to tighten with understanding, though no one spoke. Clara and Alice were frozen, as though a single wrong movement might shatter the fragile clarity that had just settled over them. Miss Marple's voice, when she continued, was softer still. Mrs. Penbury is a caretaker of memory. Her entire life is built of what she tends, preserves, protects, the church flowers, the hymnals, the graves, the past. It gives her purpose, and those who threaten the memory of something she once cherished. She believes she must manage them. Alice looked pained. But Stephen never knew her. He never mentioned her. He had nothing to do with her fiancé. No, Miss Marple agreed. But grief does not reason. It echoes. Mr. Halcombe reminded her of a man she once loved, and Stephen reminded her of the one who took that happiness away. Or so she believed. The mind can weave likeness where none exists. Clara felt her sister's hand tighten around her own, both grounding each other. Inspector Graves exhaled slowly. We need to speak to her. Miss Marple nodded once. Yes, but gently, Inspector. Mrs. Penbury does not know she has done anything wrong. To her, this was an act of mercy and justice. They stepped out into the cool night air. Mrs. Penbury was only a few houses away, standing by her garden gate, speaking amiably with Mr. Finch, the postmaster. She smiled when she saw them approach, as though they were simply out for evening stroll. Inspector Miss Marple, good evening. Her tone was pleasant, warm, exactly as always. And dear Clara, oh, it is so good to see you home. And Alice too, though you look tired, my dear. You must try to rest. She reached forward, almost motherly in gesture. Alice flinched. Just the smallest movement. But Mrs. Penbury noticed. Something softened in her expression, a deep, weary understanding. She folded her hands neatly in front of her. "Ah," she breathed. "So you know." Inspector Graves did not raise his voice. "Mrs. Penberry, we'd like you to come with us to the vicarage so we can talk about what happened." She gave a faint, wistful smile. "I thought I had arranged it so carefully. The bell was the only way to ensure he was found with dignity. Not taken away by foxes or left in the cold." She shook her head slowly, almost tenderly. He looked so small, lying there, smaller than when he walked the lane arguing with that poor man. Clara made a small sound of grief and realization. "So you did see," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Penberry nodded. "They were shouting near the old quarry road. I didn't mean to watch. But voices carry so clearly when the wind is right." And then he fell, and Mr. Halcombe ran to him, crying, begging him to breathe. Her eyes filled, not with guilt, but with memory. "I saw that same grief 40 years ago. I knew what would follow. Whispering, rumor, blame, and I couldn't have it. Not again. He has suffered enough." Alice whispered. "You moved him," and rang the bell. "A death deserves to be witnessed," Mrs. Penberry said simply. "Otherwise it is only a disappearance, and disappearances fester." There was no madness in her tone, only certainty. Terrible, devastating certainty. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "Mrs. Penberry, we must ask you to come with us now." She did not resist. She simply laid her gardening gloves on the stone wall beside her gate, a gesture of quiet conclusion, as though setting aside a duty completed. "As you wish, Inspector. I have only ever tried to keep this village whole." Clara covered her mouth to keep from crying. Alice looked away. Trembling, the village bell tower stood quiet in the evening sky, its single toll now understood in full. A message, a memorial, a misjudgment, born of grief that had never healed. And Miss Marple stood last, watching Mrs. Penberry walk toward the vicarage, escorted, but not dragged. Dignified in her sorrow, certain in her belief. The kindest hearts, Miss Marple knew, were sometimes the most dangerous, not because they wished harm, but because they could not see the boundary between saving and breaking. And in St. Mildred's, the boundary had been crossed long before the bell had rung. They returned to the vicarage quietly, as though the village itself were listening. Mrs. Penberry did not look around as she walked. She kept her gaze straight ahead, face composed, her hands calm at her sides. It was a stillness that came not from defiance, but from the kind of certainty that does not question itself. There was no triumph in her, only a weary resolve. Inside, Inspector Graves asked that she sit in the small parlor, away from Halcombe and the sisters. The constable stood near the doorway, not as a guard, but as a witness. Mrs. Penberry folded her hands in her lap and waited, as though for a service to begin. Clara and Alice remained in the adjoining room. Alice sat nearest the fire, silent, her hands clasped tightly together. Clara hovered close beside her, as if any distance might allow fear to return. Miss Marple watched them for a moment before stepping softly back into the parlor with Inspector Graves. He took his seat across from Mrs. Penberry, but Miss Marple remained standing, quiet, steady, observant. It was Mrs. Penberry who spoke first. "Mr. Halcombe loved her, you know," she said gently. "Not as a man loves a woman, but as one who recognizes a soul in pain. He saw what Stephen brought with him, the shadows, the strain. Mr. Halcombe knew it. He has known sorrow longer than any of us." Inspector Graves rested his hands on his knees. "But you believed Stephen meant harm. You assumed." "No," Mrs. Penberry replied, and her voice was almost tender. "I recognized the pattern. It was the same with Thomas. Her eyes softened with memory that had never dulled. He was a gentle man, good, but he trusted someone he should not have. That someone took advantage of his kindness and left him ruined in spirit. And then, her voice caught briefly, though her composure never fully broke. Then came the fall. Everyone called it an accident. But grief is a chain, Inspector. It does not break. It travels through lives, attaching itself where it finds the same shape. Miss Marple stepped closer, not to challenge her, but to be heard without harshness. "Mrs. Penbury," she said, "Stephen did not ruin Alice, nor would he have." The fear she felt was not of Stephen. It was of losing him to whatever past he carried. She loved him enough to be afraid of that. Mrs. Penbury blinked, just once, slowly. "That is what I did not understand," she murmured. "I thought I was saving her. I thought I was preventing another tragedy." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "You prevented the truth from appearing in its natural form, and grief, when rearranged, becomes something else entirely, something much harder to bear." Inspector Graves spoke then, quiet but firm. "You will need to come to the station. There will be statements, inquiries. This will not be hidden." Mrs. Penbury nodded. "I understand. I will answer what must be answered." There was no struggle, no resistance. She rose when asked, allowed herself to be escorted, leaving behind the familiar comfort of the vicarage without looking back. Only the faint rustle of her skirt marked her departure. When she was gone, the vicarage felt oddly hollow. Though still warm with lamplight, Alice looked up as Miss Marple returned to her side. "Will they blame Mr. Halcombe?" she whispered. "He didn't mean for any of this. He tried to save Stephen." Miss Marple took her hand, her touch light but certain. "No, my dear. The truth is known now, and truth, when spoken fully, can settle more gently than silence ever can." Alice leaned into her sister, finally allowing her tears to come. Quiet tears, not frantic ones. Clara held her, and the two sat in a closeness that felt like something returning home. Inspector Graves stood at the window, looking toward the churchyard where the bell tower rose against the night sky. "One toll," he said softly, "one message, and all of this followed." Miss Marple joined him there, her gaze gently upward. "Bells have always been for calling attention," she replied. "The living answer them far more urgently than the dead." The inspector exhaled, a long, steady breath. The village outside had settled into its evening hush. Lights glowed behind curtains. A dog barked once, then quieted. The wind moved the hedges with a slow, whispering ease, as though the land, too, had been holding something tense until now. Miss Marple gathered her shawl, preparing to leave. "People will speak of this in the village," she said, "for a very long time, but they will not speak unkindly. Grief is understood here, and kindness, well, kindness is never quite what it appears, but it is still kindness." She paused at the door. "And tomorrow," she added, "the flowers in the church will still need arranging. Someone else will do it, but they will not think of it as simply a chore." She gave a small, thoughtful smile. "They will think of it as care." Miss Marple stepped out into the cool evening, the sky now a deep and velvety blue, scattered with faint stars. The village lay quiet, too quiet, perhaps, like a room where someone has just finished speaking and everyone is listening for whatever comes next. The soft lamplight along the lanes cast long shadows across the stone walls and hedgerows, and the bell tower of St. Mildred's rose dark and solemn against the sky. The inspector walked beside her for a short distance, neither speaking right away. They passed the green, where only hours earlier whispers had swirled like autumn leaves. Now the benches were empty, and even the wind seemed to tread lightly. "It is a strange thing," Inspector Graves said finally, his voice low. "One tries to find justice in these matters, and yet here everyone was trying to do right, and still a man is dead." Miss Marple's steps remained steady. "Justice is rarely a matter of clear sides, Inspector. Motives are often sympathetic. Harm does not always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from fear, or from love that has nowhere left to go." He nodded, thoughtful. "Will the village forgive her?" "Oh," Miss Marple said softly, "villages forgive more easily than they forget. They will speak of Mrs. Penberry in lowered tones for a time. Some will defend her, some will condemn her, but eventually she will become a quiet part of the story of this place. Not a villain, not quite a victim either. Something more human." They paused where the lane forked, one way leading to Miss Marple's cottage, the other toward the station where Mrs. Penberry would be taken. Before the inspector took his leave, he turned once more. "You knew," he said, though not accusingly. "Before any of us. When did you first begin to suspect her?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, the expression touched with sadness. "When she fainted at the sight of Stephen's body," she replied, too quickly, too perfectly, a faint of someone who understood precisely what she was seeing and needed to appear overwhelmed. Real shock is rarely graceful, Inspector. It is clumsy, disordered. Mrs. Penberry has spent her life making her grief look tidy." He exhaled slowly, as though the last of something heavy had finally left him. "I will remember that." Miss Marple dipped her head in a small nod, not a gesture of triumph, but of acknowledgment between two people who understood that truth was seldom neat. "Good night, Inspector. Good night, Miss Marple." She walked her road alone now, though she did not seem lonely. Her small cottage waited with its familiar lamp glowing warmly through lace curtains. Inside, on her small wooden table, her knitting lay where she had left it that morning. Quiet, patient, unchanged. She sat, picked it up, and resumed her work with gentle, rhythmic motions, not hurried, not heavy, simply steady. The village outside settled into sleep. Windows darkened. The wind moved the branches with a soft sighing sound. Somewhere, a night bird called once, then fell silent again. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, like the faint ticking of a clock, measuring something more delicate than time. People would speak. Tomorrow, the story would travel. New misunderstandings would take shape. Grief would soften at its own pace. Life would resume its ordinary rhythms. Gardens tended, letters posted, tea poured, and St. Mildred's would remember, as villages always do. Miss Marple paused a moment and looked toward the window, where the silhouette of the bell tower stood still in the night. "One toll," she murmured, not unkindly. A signal, a warning, a farewell. Then she returned to her knitting, her expression composed, her eyes thoughtful, always watching, always knowing that beneath every quiet village lay the whole of human nature, tender and terrible, intertwined. The next morning arrived quietly, as though the village wished not to disturb its own stillness. The mist lay low across the fields and along the stone walls, softening edges and muting sound. St. Mildred's woke slowly. Windows opened, kettles whistled, and a few cautious conversations began over hedges and front gates. But the hush had not lifted. It simply shifted into something watchful. Miss Marple rose early, as she always did. She moved through her morning with the same small, deliberate rituals. Heating the kettle, laying out a single teacup, folding a napkin neatly beside her plate. There was comfort in the simple order of familiar things. Yet when she stepped outside for her walk along the green, she found Clara waiting quietly at her gate. She was alone. "May I walk with you?" Clara asked. Miss Marple nodded and began at a gentle pace. Clara matched her steps, slow enough to think, steady enough to speak when ready. "I keep remembering," Clara began, "how we were all so sure yesterday, how everything felt settled, but it doesn't feel settled now. It feels unfinished." Miss Marple did not offer reassurance. Not yet. Clara's voice was searching, not fearful. "Alice is resting," Clara continued, "but she wakes easily. She watches the window. I think she is waiting for something. A pause, or for someone." Miss Marple felt the weight of that truth quietly. "Grief," she said softly, "has a way of arriving in waves. It reveals what shock conceals." Clara looked down at her hands. Alice blames herself, not for Stephen's death, but for not understanding him sooner, for not asking enough questions. She believes there was something he meant to tell her before. Everything. There it was, the unfinished thread. Miss Marple slowed slightly, her gaze drifting toward the distant bell tower, calm and silent now. "Yes," she said gently. "He meant to meet Mr. Halcombe, but that was not the only meeting arranged. Someone else was waiting for him as well." Clara looked up sharply. "Who?" Miss Marple's voice remained mild, almost conversational. "Someone who knew Stephen before his engagement. Someone who knew the true nature of the trouble he carried. Someone who may have wished to keep that trouble close, either out of loyalty or out of advantage." They turned a corner, passing Mrs. Carter's garden, where yesterday's gossip had once spun with quick tongues. Today Mrs. Carter simply nodded to them, subdued. Clara swallowed. "Do you mean someone in the village?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Someone who saw Stephen and Alice arrive. Someone who knew the old meeting place near the quarry. Someone who told Mrs. Harbury, quietly, discreetly, that Stephen had not traveled here alone." Clara stopped walking, her breath caught, not in shock, but in recognition. "Mr. Finch," she whispered. Miss Marple nodded once. "The postmaster sees all letters. He knows every journey taken, every telegram sent. He knew Stephen was coming. He knew Alice was with him, and he knew Halcombe had asked not to see Stephen again." Clara's voice trembled. "So No," Miss Marple said softly. "He did not cause the fall. He did not harm Stephen, but he ensured the meeting occurred. He told Stephen where to find Halcombe. He directed him toward the one place where old grief lives like a shadow." Clara sank onto the low stone wall beside them. "He thought he was helping," she murmured. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "or perhaps he wanted the past to repeat itself. Some people cannot bear to live outside sorrow. They arrange it quietly, carefully, so that it feels inevitable." The morning light broke through the mist then, faint gold spreading slowly across the rooftops and chimneys.
The village was waking fully now, its rhythms resuming. Clara lifted her chin.
"Will the inspector confront him?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "in time, though there is little to charge him with beyond meddling, and grief is rarely prosecuted." Clara wiped at her eyes, composed, but changed. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Miss Marple said, resuming her walk, and Clara gently followed. "The village learns to breathe again. Alice will heal in her own time. Mr. Halcombe will not be alone. There are those here who understand him better now. And Mrs. Penbury," a soft pause, "she will have peace at last, though not the kind she once tried to create." Clara looked ahead. "And you, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I shall have my garden, and my knitting, and the small details of village life. There is always something to observe. People do not change all at once, my dear. Not really. They simply show themselves more clearly when life shakes them a little." Clara released a slow breath, steadier than before. The village road stretched ahead, ordinary, familiar, unchanged, and the bell tower stood silent, waiting, watching, as all old bells do. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet gentleness, as though St. Mildred's itself had chosen to lower its voice. Word of the events spread, of course. It always did. But the tone was not sharp or sensational. Instead, it carried the soft murmur of shared sorrow. The inquest confirmed what Miss Marple had understood from the start. Stephen Harbury had fallen by misstep during a heated confrontation. His death was tragic, but not intentional. Mr. Halcombe, though deeply shaken, was no murderer. He remained under care for a time, not as punishment, but for rest of mind, and he accepted that help quietly, as one who had carried far too much for far too long. Mrs. Penberry's part in matters was spoken of very carefully. She had acted out of grief, not malice, rearranging a scene to preserve what she believed was dignity. The law took note of her actions, but also of her age, her long-standing kindness, and the absence of any intent to harm. She would not return to her small cottage, but she did not protest. She had carried her grief as far as it could follow her. The village did not turn against her. It simply sighed. People left flowers where she once placed them. Alice recovered slowly, with Clara always near. She did not speak often at first. Her silence held layers of guilt and tenderness and the fragile beginnings of acceptance. But there was no bitterness in her grief, only love for the man she had lost, and the recognition that fear had never meant lack of love. She returned to Market Harrow when she was ready, not hastily, not to escape, but to begin again. Miss Marple walked her to the train herself. Alice held her hand. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. Not just who did what, but why. Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes warm and wise. "People show us who they are, my dear, in small ways, in the pause before they answer, in what they choose to remember, and what they work very hard not to." Alice nodded, though her eyes shimmered. The train bell sounded. She stepped aboard. Miss Marple stood on the platform until the train disappeared beyond the field. Then she walked home, as she always did, unhurried, attentive to the world around her. In the village, life shifted back into its familiar pattern. The church bell remained silent, except for its rightful place in the rhythm of worship and farewell. Someone new arranged the flowers, tentatively at first, then with growing surety. The meadow grew green. The river followed its course. Conversations resumed at the bakery, the post office, the tea shop, softer now, more thoughtful, and in her cottage beside the green, Miss Marple knitted by lamplight, her needles moving in their gentle, unwavering rhythm, a quiet reminder that mysteries end. Yes, but people continue. The bell had rung once, for a life lost, and a sorrow laid bare. And now, it did not need to ring again, because truth, once seen clearly, has a silence of its own.